Oh, the recording has started. We also believe in enthusiastic consent. If you do not wish to be recorded, you just have to mute your video and you will not show up on the recording. But Joy has asked for a recording to share with some people who couldn't make it. This is the great thing about technology is if you miss a talk, you can see it in the virtual, and certainly sharing Joy's work and sharing the joy is a lovely byproduct of the technology that we use. So welcome everybody. My name is Jessica Riddell. I'm a professor in the Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Quebec, and also the executive director of the Maple League of Universities, which is a consortium of 4 primarily undergraduate universities dedicated to a quality undergraduate education. We have a number of different programs and series. We have a Welcome to Our Online Classroom series that happens every Thursday, and every month we invite a internationally recognized leader and scholar on higher education, and particularly around the notion of how do we design for quality undergraduate education in this moment in time. And, there is a sense of urgency as we make decisions and we go through intentional design to build our post-COVID world and our post-COVID universities. And I think that we have a tremendous opportunity today to welcome Dr. Joy Mighty to help us think through some of those wicked problems and tangled knots, and to think intentionally about how to make our spaces more inclusive, more resilient, and more hopeful. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Joy Mighty as our internationally recognized scholar today. I have been a fan of Joy's for probably about 20 years. I first encountered Joy when she was at Queen's leading teaching and learning, and I was a grad student and I was brand new to the notion of teaching and learning in higher education, and she was just the most generous and wonderful leader who I admired from afar. And over the years, been able to connect with her more, whether it's at conferences in Atlanta or virtually. And she's been a mentor and a guide for so many people. She's had a transformative impact on higher education, not just in teaching and learning, but in post-secondary education in Canada and beyond. And it is just an absolute thrill to have her join us and to take us through a thought process today. A very quick bio is that although Dr. Joy Mighty has recently retired from Carleton University, she is still so active in mentoring and researching and sharing her knowledge. Before her retirement, she served as Carleton's Associate Vice President, Teaching and Learning, and later as a Senior Scholar for Innovation in Teaching and Learning through the Office of the Provost and Vice President, Academic. She has a rich and varied academic background and a wealth of experience as an administrator, a teacher, an educational developer, a researcher, and a consultant. Her special interests are in organizational development and change, so her work is, I think, even more urgent and relevant now than ever. And her emphasis on equity, diversity, and the scholarship of teaching and learning challenges us to think about the systems in place and how to challenge the actual in the name of the possible. She consults all over the world for public, private, and not-for-profit organizations in Canada, the Caribbean, China, England, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, etc. She's probably got the most colorful passport of stamps, and yet she's doing this now in the virtual and sharing her expertise and sharing her knowledge in ways that are still profoundly impacting our thinking. I could go on, but I need to stop talking, mute myself, and let Joy take us through a journey over the next 30 minutes. So please join me in a warm welcome of Dr. Joy Mighty.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that heartfelt welcome and introduction. And thank you for inviting me to participate in the Maple League of Universities in this speaker series. I'm really impressed by the whole idea of the Maple League of Universities, and I know we talked about it. I'd love to know more about it and to sort of keep track of the progress of this Maple League. I love it. I feel really honored and privileged to be given this opportunity to share my perspectives and my passion with you. So please accept my heartfelt gratitude. Thank you. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, which I respectfully acknowledge as the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. In pre-pandemic times, I would be speaking to you in person. I'd be visiting you, probably sitting beside a cozy fire, sipping a cup of hot chocolate on this wintry day. But alas, the reality is that I'm in my home, as I imagine most of you are, keeping my fingers crossed that I don't lose my internet connection over the next hour or so. And I have neither a cozy fire nor that comforting cup of hot chocolate, but I trust that you are all out there somewhere in cyberspace, and I hope that we can still have a warm and spirited conversation about my chosen topic, which is embracing the spirit of Ubuntu, implications for transforming teaching and learning in higher education. As a useful point of departure, I will share my concerns about some ways in which universities have been conceptualized by many of us in academia, by our students, and by other stakeholders such as governments, employers, parents, and the public at large. I will then introduce the idea of moving beyond these dominant conceptions of university by embracing the spirit of Ubuntu. After a brief exposition of the Ubuntu philosophy, I'll conclude by exploring what a university that embraces Ubuntu. So let me begin by reflecting for a minute on conceptions of the role of the university in our world today. How many times recently have we not heard challenges about the usefulness or lack thereof of a university degree, particularly a degree in the arts and social sciences, in helping one to get a job? For years now, we've been besieged by proclamations and research findings about the so-called skills gap, which refers to the disparity between, on the one hand, the skills that employers claim to need for the stability, growth, and success of their organizations, and presumably by extension for the country's economy and ultimately for the public good, and on the other hand, the skills that graduates appear to have acquired as a result of their university education. A recent survey of over 400 employers in Canada found that only 19% believe that graduates of post-secondary institutions are adequately prepared to meet the employment needs of their organizations. As many as 62% of respondents felt that, and I quote, there is too much emphasis on book learning and not enough on real-world learning, whatever that means. Many so-called pundits advocate abandoning liberal arts subjects such as philosophy, art history, and the classics, etc. After all, they argue, what good is a liberal arts degree if you can't get a job with it? And how do such subjects, contribute to a country's productivity and economic advancement anyway? Instead, they advocate that more students should pursue STEM subjects, meaning practical studies in science, technology, engineering, and math that translate more readily into well-paying jobs. It is no coincidence that there has been increased interest in apprenticeship programs, which are prime examples of practical skills training, with jobs as their ultimate outcome. Indeed, only 5 years ago, a report sponsored by the Business Council of Canada, which incidentally is one of the largest lobby groups in Canada, recommended cutting university enrollment by 30% in favor of increased enrollments in community colleges and polytechnics. A common rebuttal that many of us in the university often give is that universities are not for vocational training, meaning training for a career in manual labor, referring, of course, to the role often attributed to community colleges, which have unfortunately been denigrated to second-class status in the academic hierarchy. Yet, one of the fastest growing segments of the student body at community colleges is made up of people who already have a 4-year university degree and then return to college, a community college, to get a marketable trade skill. This is consistent with a finding in the survey of Canadian employers that I mentioned earlier, where 38% of respondents felt that they need graduates with a blend of technical and so-called soft skills. which include, of course, oral and written communication, interpersonal, teamwork, and problem-solving skills, all ironically gained from the much-aligned liberal arts. This finding is part of a growing trend to hire T-shaped professionals, a concept that refers to employees with both soft skills, that's the T-top, and practical skills about processes or products, the T-stem. But several studies suggest that a so-called skills gap does not really exist. In one study by the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Development in Ontario, 79% of graduates who are employed full-time perceive their work as either somewhat or closely related to the skills they developed at university. So at least from these students' perspective, university has prepared them for their jobs. According to another study, as many as 87% of first-year students surveyed were more likely to choose their programs of study based on passion and interest rather than on perceived job prospects or potential income. This is not to say that they do not think of their jobs and career prospects. In fact, in the same survey, 44% of respondents believed that their chosen program would also influence their job placement and income potential. But their primary motivation for choosing their programs was their intense passion. And most incoming students do expect that the experience of university would increase or at least sustain their intrinsic motivation for the area of study about which they are already passionate. But are their expectations met? John Henry Newman, in his now famous and impactful 19th century discourse in Dublin on the idea of the university, this was the impetus for setting up universities in Ireland, described the business of a university as advancement of knowledge through research, extension of knowledge through undergraduate and graduate teaching, training that involves both knowledge and professional skill in the programs or schools of the university, preservation of knowledge in libraries, galleries, and museums, and diffusion of knowledge through scholarly publications. It would have been terribly disappointing had Newman stopped there, delineating the business of a university as mere advancement and diffusion of knowledge and training and professional skills. But thankfully, he went further, ultimately conceiving the university as providing training of the intellect, which is best not only for individuals themselves, but which best enables those individuals to discharge what he calls their duties to society. Newman argues for the potential of the university to bring together diverse perspectives and areas of expertise in service of greater understanding, developing sensitivities toward and making significant contributions to various local, national, and international communities in what has come to be seen as a moral contract of sorts. This latter aspect of the university may manifest itself in service in ensuring quality of opportunity for the disadvantaged, and in opposing discrimination on the grounds of race, color, nationality, religion, sexuality, ability, or any other aspect of social identity. Moreover, this moral dimension of the university, according to Newman, must become an essential element of its mission, not from any pressure of public opinion, but because it is fitting and right to undertake it. There's no doubt that universities have contributed to the development of civilization through the creation, dissemination, and application of knowledge. Yet, despite the university's contributions to society in various fields, many members of the public still perceive it as an ivory tower, a term used pejoratively to refer to the tendency of the university to be disconnected from the real world. There's that word again. It is still perceived in some circles as an elitist, socially disengaged institution that exists in intellectual isolation, engaged in what many consider to be useless research endeavors that have no relevance to everyday life. It is also true that the university's social engagement in the real world has not always been kindly received, in part because of a perception by some members of the communities being helped that university helpers are patronizing and paternalistic, with, paradoxically, little regard for the humanity of the people they're helping. In fact, many surveys have revealed a tendency for universities engaged in such initiatives to slip into ethnocentric habits, and their increasing interest in so-called internationalization has also been criticized as a money-making initiative rather than a genuine commitment to diffusing the benefits of education across the globe, as Newman's duties to society might suggest. Yet a quick search on the internet reveals that almost all universities in Canada today, including the Maple League of Universities, express in their mission and vision statements their goals to foster civic responsibility and enhance social justice and make a significant difference or develop leaders for a global society. But increasingly, I find myself asking, are we, and by extension our graduates, fulfilling our duties to society? Are our universities meeting the current historical context? And what is that context? As we become more global and as the population explosion, technological advances, and environmental crises of the 21st century bring us closer together, we are witnessing increases in global refugee crises, poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, and the rapid spread of previously eradicated or unknown diseases, such as the deadly COVID-19. This pandemic has highlighted the inequities in many of our social systems and services, and their adverse impact on the historically marginalized and disadvantaged, including women, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, members of racialized groups, persons with different socioeconomic status, and members of 2SLBGTQ+ communities. Above all, it has helped to awaken the entire world to the realities of widespread systemic and structural racism and racial injustice, particularly against BIPOC communities. Who was not touched in 2020 by the horrendous public murder of George Floyd, which was the catalyst for the groundswell of protests and a racial reckoning in the US, Canada, and across the globe? In this context, the question remains, are we doing enough? Although the university has made a difference in our material life, the most important question for me is, has it made a real difference in the way we perceive and treat others, especially others whose social identity is different from ours? To what extent has the university been able to reduce prejudice and racism, sexism and ethnocentrism, discrimination and inequity, xenophobia, and other related intolerances that continue to fracture our world? Despite public statements about their commitment to fulfilling their duties to society, I seriously question whether most universities have made the moral dimension of these duties their primary mission. To do so would require much more than politically correct mission statements, and nothing less than major educational reform. In my view, what we need is to embrace the spirit of Ubuntu as a philosophy of education. And what do I mean by Ubuntu, and how would it move the university closer to fulfilling its duties to society? In recent years, the word Ubuntu has been appropriated and used for the name of a new computer operating system, which I know nothing about. And I understand there's even a drink named Ubuntu now. but when I use it, I'm referring to the original meaning of the word. Ubuntu is a Zulu word that I learned and absolutely fell in love with on my first visit to South Africa many, many years ago. In its most fundamental sense, it stands for collective personhood and means literally, I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. It is a concept of collective unity, and it suggests that a person can only be a person through others. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the 1984 Nobel Peace Laureate, explains, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Ubuntu is a way of thinking, of living our lives where the focus is not on the intellectual and the physical dimensions of our humanity, but rather on the emotional and the spiritual. This is not a concept that's unique to South Africa. It's called by different names in different societies. The indigenous peoples of Canada have various words and phrases that mean the honor of one is the honor of all, and the honor of all is the honor of one. It's the same concept that the English poet John Donne expressed in his famous poem when he wrote, no man is an island, no man stands alone. And I think we can forgive Donne for failing to use gender-neutral language. He was a product of his time. Although Ubuntu is a popular concept in various parts of Africa, all marginalized and dispossessed peoples throughout the world have implicitly practiced Ubuntu in order to survive colonization, displacement, underdevelopment, and poverty. Because of the material circumstances of poverty and powerlessness, such communities have survived not on the principles of individual self-sufficiency or on the acquisition of material or economic wealth, but rather on the principles of collective solidarity. Ubuntu is not just an abstract concept. It permeates every aspect of African, Indian, and Asian life, and their respective diasporas, such as those in the Caribbean, Canada, and the US. It is expressed in our collective singing, dancing, and storytelling, in our collective ways of observing funerals, expressing grief and joy, in our celebrations, our rituals, and forms of worship. Ubuntu's emphasis on our interconnectedness as humans is reflected in the national mottos of many of our countries. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, the motto is, together we aspire, together we achieve. In Jamaica, it is, out of many, one people. And in Guyana, my native land, it is one people, one nation, one destiny. Our peoples, the black, brown, yellow, and red people of this world, have survived the injustice and inhumanity of slavery and indentured labor, of colonization and exploitation, of prejudice and racism, of discrimination and inequity because of the spirit of Ubuntu. Our interconnectedness as humans is also reflected in vivid metaphors and many proverbs and sayings of peoples who have experienced a history of oppression. Try to picture the unity evoked by these proverbs. Rain does not fall on one roof, and neither does the sun shine on one house alone. Picture it. One broomstick is easier to break than the bundle. One tree does not make a forest. One ant cannot build an anthill. And my all-time favorite, one hand cannot clap. Go ahead and try clapping with one hand and tell me how you make out. I dare you. One final example of the spirit of Ubuntu at work comes from contemplating the lives and work of martyrs like Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or that of my idol, the dynamic and inspirational leadership of Nelson Mandela. Can you tell I love South Africa? I have to tell you that visiting Robben Island, where Mandela was imprisoned, and seeing the tiny cell in which this big man ate and slept and lived for so long, was for me a very humbling, emotional, and profoundly impactful experience. My guide was himself a former political prisoner who was at Robben Island while Mandela was there. He explained that he was one of the many prisoners who entered Robben Island without education and left as a highly educated man because of the surreptitious and illegal lessons taught by Mandela and others like him who were already educated when they were in prison. At the risk of severe punishment by the prison guards, Mandela sought to develop his fellow South Africans and to build a community within the confines of the prison. Even in prison, he focused not on his individual achievements and needs, but on improving the lot of his fellow prisoners and, of course, that of all his compatriots. His exemplary life was an inspiration to all of us. All of these leaders, Gandhi, King, and Mandela, were brilliant, highly educated individuals who could easily have lived private and, I dare say, safe lives. Instead, they upheld the philosophy of collective unity and solidarity and dedicated their lives to freeing their people. The lessons from my ancestors who were slaves and indentured laborers, from Gandhi, King, Mandela, and all the other inspiring men and women in the history of the Caribbean, Canada, and the rest of the Americas and other displaced communities, indicate that Ubuntu has been our path to survival as a people. And it may yet be the way we defeat COVID-19, as according to the experts, the virus anywhere is the virus everywhere. So what if we were to adopt Ubuntu as our philosophy of education? What would a university look like with Ubuntu as its mantra? First, the overarching purpose of a university education would be not to prepare individuals for a job or a career, but to make a significant difference in the world. It would seek to ensure that everyone who receives a university education becomes a responsible citizen, contributing to making the world a better place. The goal would not be to acquire knowledge for its own sake, but to contribute to society's well-being by solving together the significant problems of the world. In carrying out its moral purpose and implementing its duties to society, the university with Ubuntu as its underlying philosophy would value diversity, ensuring that it is reflected both in those whom it teaches and in what it teaches them. That is, diversity would be apparent in both the members of the university, administrators, faculty, students, staff, and in the curriculum. Valuing diversity requires that we rethink three very important pedagogical questions. These are, what should we include in our curricula? How should we teach that content? And what kind of learning environments should we foster? Under Ubuntu, we simply could not carry on with business as usual, especially in the face of the enormous challenges of an increasingly diverse population. Instead, we would use the diversity within our classrooms as an opportunity to engage in what has been variously called teaching for inclusion, equity pedagogy, or diversity pedagogy. These terms all refer to a multifaceted approach to consciously infusing diversity in the curriculum, teaching methodologies, and learning environments, so that all students, regardless of their social identity, have an equal chance to learn and be academically successful. So what should we include in our curricula? Under Ubuntu, our curricula would continuously expose students to diverse content with relevant multiple perspectives and materials. We often choose the content that is most comfortable for us, without acknowledging that our knowledge is derived from a particular social and political context, and may therefore be subject to cultural bias. Embracing the philosophy of Ubuntu requires that we challenge existing paradigms and question the cultural values we are propagating. Embracing Ubuntu would result in curricula that are truly interdisciplinary and diverse, providing multiple new and global perspectives, not only for altruistic reasons, but for practical reasons as well. It has long been recognized that there is no significant problem of the world that can be solved by one discipline alone. The enormity and complexity of the social, political, economic, and environmental problems that face the global community demand remedies and solutions that far exceed the capacity of any single discipline or specialization. Instead, these problems call for new interdisciplinary approaches that draw on multiple perspectives and integrative techniques. An excellent example is that of the Human Genome Project, on which numerous disciplines and countries collaborated to research and understand the genetic makeup of the human being, an issue of enormous importance to the entire human race. And of course, there's the more recent example of the global collaboration to understand COVID-19 and develop vaccines to fight it. Whereas today's graduates tend to be experts in one or maybe two content areas, and often have to go back to school, learn on the job, or find some other means of educating themselves in other areas, graduates of the universities that embraces Ubuntu would be better equipped to solve old as well as new problems. I envisage that an Ubuntu-guided university would admit students based on the questions the students want answered, or the social problems they want to have solved. For example, a student might be selected to work on a specified health problem, or on an environmental challenge, or on a social problem such as a particular aspect of poverty or malnutrition or homelessness. Once admitted, students would choose from a cafeteria-style curriculum, studying from a menu of subjects and collaborating with professors and peers across disciplines to find answers to their questions. To be able to tackle the wicked problems of the 21st century, students need to develop the ability to communicate and work with not only people who speak different languages, but also with people who have different disciplinary orientations, backgrounds, and worldviews. These problems need people who can think critically and innovatively, and people who are willing and able to confront challenges about themselves and the world. The world needs people who can appreciate others' perspectives, evaluate information from experts, tolerate ambiguity, and people who can synthesize and integrate lots of new information. These attributes transcend the technical knowledge associated with specific disciplines and professions. In essence, to be able to connect with people who are different in the spirit of Ubuntu, students would need to develop both the ability to work effectively in multidisciplinary, multinational, and multicultural teams, and the capacity to develop creative solutions to shared problems. The second pedagogical question we would need to rethink under the Ubuntu philosophy concerns how we teach. What teaching processes should we use? We must examine our teaching practices and the assumptions on which they're based. Ubuntu would require us to use instructional methods that foster respect for differences, to engage students in ways that encourage them to perspectives. We must shift their focus from competition to collaboration. This suggests that we must use collaborative and interactive pedagogies, consciously modeling the value of diversity in our teaching and ensuring increased access to university education for all, with multiple flexible forms of delivery, from fully face-to-face to fully online. We must make greater use of multi-pronged, student-centered teaching methodologies, involving innovative, high-impact practices with a range of active and collaborative learning approaches in which students are purposefully involved. For example, students would engage in a just-in-time, inquiry-based style of education, where they would study and research subjects as they need them, when that knowledge is most relevant to the questions they're seeking to answer. The goal would be to empower and engage students through self-discovery and high-level thinking that allow them to learn deeply, to see the relevance and value to humanity of what they're learning, and to continue learning and applying their learning to society's consequential problems long after they've left the sphere of our immediate influence in university. The third pedagogical question that Ubuntu requires us to rethink is, what kind of learning environments should we foster? Adopting the philosophy of Ubuntu requires that we foster non-threatening, inclusive learning environments characterized by safety and trust, where every student can feel valued. We must find ways of making all students feel that they are part of a classroom community, regardless of their identity. No student should ever feel silenced, marginalized, excluded, or alienated by the learning environments we create. Let me share with you a quotation from an Indigenous teacher, Darrell McLeod, who poignantly expresses the marginalization and alienation he experienced as a Cree student in an educational system that failed to acknowledge his social identity. It's somewhat dated. It was written in 1996, I think. But I think it still captures the experiences of many BIPOC students in our institutions today. So here's his quote. Here's the quote from him. I have spent all of my life living in a dominant society that never validated who I was as an Aboriginal person. My formal education took place in a setting where my truths and my world were never reflected in the learning environment. Neither my ways of thinking nor my ways of doing were validated, even though I believe they were what got me through the system and afforded me whatever success I have experienced. In order to learn what I was being taught, I had to constantly deny the basic tenets of who I am and what I believe. That's the end of the quote. It always gets me emotional. Such a learning environment would not exist in institutions guided by Ubuntu. In addition, administrative structures and learning spaces would change so that students would not necessarily remain with the same cohort or follow a timetable structured in a linear way. Traditional auditorium or lecture style learning spaces as we know them today would be relics of the past, replaced by flexible spaces, including online spaces, that are conducive to interaction and collaboration. Students would learn not just from their professors and fellow students, but also from and in the communities with which they would work on their chosen problems. In summary then, embracing the philosophy of Ubuntu would help us to pay closer attention to designing what we teach, how we teach, and the environments we create for learning. Ultimately, embracing Ubuntu would mean fully engaging students with a learning experience that is flexible, adaptable, and meaningful, one that leads to success at the university and beyond. Most importantly, having such a philosophy guide our educational choices would result in valuing human diversity. We would have moved beyond seeing the university as a place for advancing our individual professions and careers to becoming full participants in society with a focus on fulfilling our duties to society by celebrating our collective personhood. As a result of its direct and indirect contributions, the university would enjoy a better relationship with society. It would no longer be considered an ivory tower that is inaccessible and distant from the communities in which it is embedded. So let us hope that our educational structures, systems, and especially our pedagogies will undergo the philosophical, qualitative, and practical reforms necessary to promote in each of our students the spirit of Ubuntu. With the humanizing spirit of Ubuntu and learning through educational reforms to work with and in and through their communities, our graduates can make a significant difference in the world. But Ubuntu begins with you and me. I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am. Decades ago, the Mahatma challenged us with these words: you must be the change you wish to see in the world. But I'll leave the final word to Amanda Gorman, the U.S. National Youth Poet Laureate, who recently reminded us in her inauguration poem, The Hill We Climb, that there is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for listening.
Joy, thank you so much, and please, as a group, join us in thanking Joy. One hand cannot clap, but both of ours are put together with you. And thank you for taking us on that journey from John Donne to Amanda Gorman and poetry to the philosophies and politics of Mandela and Gandhi. That you just modeled for us the most beautiful, collaborative, and interdisciplinary talk, weaving all of the sort of work and statistics into also art and beauty. And so thank you for sharing that with us. I would like to pass over the talking stick to Tanisha Campbell, one of our Maple League Student Fellows. She's working on knowledge mobilization and high impact practices, and this has touched upon a number of the things we've been trying to anchor and practice with our consortium. So Tanisha, would you like to facilitate the question and answer? And please feel free for all of you to engage, to unmute, and or to write your questions and ideas and thoughts in the chat, and Tanisha will facilitate. But Joy, thank you so much. That was really inspiring.
Thank you so much, Joy. I'm very moved. There are a lot of points there that definitely resonated with me, and I'm just really glad I had the opportunity to hear this. So just as an announcement for everyone else, if you want, you can drop your questions in the chat and I'll ask them. But just to start off, I do have a quick, question for you, Joy. So I know you talked about educational reform and how we need to maybe work within the system in order to bring about the results that we would like and incorporating Ubuntu. But I would also like to ask about maybe on an individual level, what lessons should we maybe teach and foster to the youth and the leaders and thinkers of tomorrow in terms of kind of making that sort of the thinking from within and then bringing that out into society?
Thank you for that question, Tanisha, and thanks for moderating the session. Well, I like to, when I'm doing this work, I like to tell people it begins with you, with the individual. So before you can go out there and do whatever you want to do, you have to understand yourself, understand and be comfortable with your identity, and acknowledge the various components, the various dimensions of our diversity. We're often ascribed a role or an identity in society. People see me, for example, and they see this Black woman, and they don't know what are the various things that go into making me who I am. But if we are true to ourselves, we have to do that ourselves and do that reflection and understand, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I want to do with myself, this is what I want to do with the world. You can't go out there and do it if you don't understand yourself. So that's, from an individual perspective, that's where I would begin.
Thank you so much. It's perfect. And we do have a few questions in the chat, so I'll start with those. We have one from Heather. She was asking about your thoughts about the role and responsibility of those in senior leadership roles and shedding ethnocentrism and embracing anti-racism. Is this leadership necessary, or can it be achieved through grassroots actors alone? She would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for that question, Heather. I actually have some thoughts about what I call, and I think it's becoming more common or more popular, what I call collective leadership. So as much as we have figureheads and we have leaders, no offense, Peter, we have presidents and we have vice presidents and that sort of thing. I think that they can model Ubuntu by engaging all peoples, all levels of the university. For example, what we're doing right now with student leadership, and you as a student fellow, you know, taking a leadership role here. I think we sometimes assume that only people with positions have ideas that can work, and that includes in our leadership, in our collective leadership, that includes the communities that we hope to work in. You know, I mentioned that sometimes those communities think that we're paternalistic and patronizing, and that's because we go and tell them what to do and what we think should be done, and we don't get their ideas very often. And it's the same thing with the university. I think that having input from various levels of the university, whether it's faculty, staff, students, and members of the community, would help to bring those diverse and new ideas together as well, and also to develop this sense of collective personhood. But you can't do it without modeling it in collective leadership.
Thanks so much.
That's perfect. And now we have another question from Ivan. He would like to know, how can we use the spirit or philosophy of Ubuntu to humanize the experiences of our BIPOC students and staff to enable true inclusion within our university spaces?
That's a good question. And for people, I realized that when I use BIPOC, I think most people know what it is, but it refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, persons of color. So it refers to groups that are often marginalized, and I think that, well, the reason I mentioned in my talk the dispossessed and the people who were colonized and taken from their homes, you know, as slaves or indentured laborers, is because those people practice Ubuntu. And I think we can take lessons from them as BIPOC people, that we can't do it alone. Our success as BIPOC people, and I obviously count myself as one, is dependent in part on the communities that surround us, the communities from which we come. And I think that those communities have modeled for us what it means, what collective solidarity and unity really mean, what those things, how we live. As I said, we could not have survived. Think about slavery, for example. The slaves could not have survived if they did not, even though they were separated and put in different, you say, plantations or wherever, so that they don't form, you know, rebellious groups from one community. These separate communities that came together in new plantations survived because they worked together and they relied on each other. So BIPOC people have to, while trying to get other people to understand them and while trying to work with other people, there has to be some of that same internal BIPOC building, allyship and community building as well, because they can't survive on their own. You know, I think, for example, just like a very practical example, when I began my academic career here in Canada, I was at the University of New Brunswick. I was the only Black female professor at the University of New Brunswick when I went there, and 11 years later, or whatever it was, 12, 13 years later, when I left, I was still the only Black female professor at the University of New Brunswick. And while I had wonderful working relationships with my colleagues and that sort of thing, I actually yearned for my community. And so I often left New Brunswick at every holiday. I went to my family, which has always been a really strong source of strength for me. My family and my guess what, my high school alumni and people that understood me. That collective solidarity was important for my survival as a single Black woman in New Brunswick. So that's my example for. I don't know if I answered the question.
Right. And then just being cognizant, we have about 4 minutes left. We have one question. This one, Lauren McKay, and she was asking, oh, sorry, from Jean-Paul Boudreau. He was asking, what are some of the immediate and, in your view, doable baby steps that we can take today in our universities to make Ubuntu a greater part of our teaching and learning world?
Baby steps. Well, I think we can begin by looking at what sort of relationship we're building with each other. I mean, those baby steps, you don't have to change anything, like any system. You don't have to change the building or anything like that to look at relationships. And for example, you can look at, well, how do I relate to my student? If I'm a professor, how do I relate to my students? How do I encourage my students to relate to each other? What do I do in the classroom? Very practically, what do I do in the classroom to ensure that they know each other, they talk to each other? Even though it doesn't apply so much to the Maple League of Universities because you tend to have small classes. But these days in a lot of universities, classes are so big that professors think, oh, I can't get to know the students, or the students can't get to know each other. That's not true. So we can do very small things like getting students to, in every single class, talk to each other, even if it's online. Find a way to get them to talk to each other. You can't begin to understand people and practice Ubuntu if we don't even know each other. And I know students go through university and come out not having a bond with people. What are we doing in terms of, making sure that people remain isolated? No. So we can do small things. In our classes, we can look for resources from other countries. I love the example of what happened at Cape Breton many, many years ago. I remember reading about this and I was so impressed. Cape Breton University, it was Cape Breton College, I think, at the time. And they wanted to look at their science. The problem was, why don't we have Indigenous students enrolling in our science program? And what did they do? They got a Mi'kmaq chief to come in and work with the Western professor, the head of the science department. And the two of them revamped the science curriculum, making sure that they can teach scientific concepts through the Indigenous ways of looking at natural scientific phenomena, as well as through the Western ways. And what they did was they rebuilt the whole science curriculum. So you had the two being working side by side, being incorporated. And what's more, they had the Mi'kmaq community come in as co-lecturers, if you will, co-teachers of the program. I was so impressed with that because that's, and you know what, they increased, the result was they increased their enrollment of Indigenous students in science programs by something like 4 to 7%, because people were beginning to understand that there are multiple ways of looking at the same thing. So a small step might be to, if we have this reading, is there another reading from Indonesia or, somewhere else, or that we can, that supports this particular Canadian reading, or, we can find ways to incorporate alternative perspectives, little ways. I hope those are two examples of baby steps.
Thank you. Merci, Joy. Merci.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Joy. And so that concludes the quick Q&A. I'm going to pass the talking stick over to Jessica for some final thoughts.
Well, thank you, Tanisha, for your constant leadership. And Joy, I was writing all over my paper with both the sort of theoretical, but also how to anchor that in practice. And you took that journey with us and gave us those 3 stages, or those 3 spaces or spheres of interrogation to create flexible, adaptable, and meaningful spaces to embody collective personhood. And I think that that's a daily act. I think that's a systems act. I think that is something, you know, as Jean-Paul pointed out, like, it is just such an inspiring and transformative philosophy that if we have it front of mind, we can anchor it in practice in many different ways. And that's actually what Paulo Freire in the Pedagogy of Hope said, that to hope just alone is to hope in vain. You have to anchor it in practice. And you've given us both the theory and the practice for us to do this work, which is, I think now, as you point out, more urgent than ever as we make decisions and intentional design for what this post-COVID world looks like. It has to be more equitable and diverse and inclusive. It has to be more human and humane. And so you've given us a roadmap for critical hope. And I'm so grateful to you all for joining us and doing that collective work together. And Joy, I'd love to continue these conversations of dreaming and scheming. So thank you everybody for coming, and thank you especially to Joy and Tanisha. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me again.